Women who have influence and who have brains and make things happen and change things around them, that doesn't fit with the picture that the woman should be subservient. So if you make her, therefore, evil, then men can say, look what happens when you put a woman in charge.
These women were extraordinary figures of their time.
Important discussions about issues like women's power, women's sexuality.
All these stories about women in the Bible have sex in common.
They have to be recast as evil. They are women who change the world around them.
When she cut Samson's hair, the Hebrew strongman lost his power, and Delilah became a synonym for temptress. But was Delilah a bad girl, or just badly misunderstood?
Even people who go to church or synagogue regularly aren't that familiar with the stories in the book of Judges. Yet Delilah is a well-known figure, and she's well-known for being seductive and a temptress.
Delilah is all about sex. She's all about sex from the beginning because her story comes in a series of stories about Samson having sex with inappropriate women.
It's the history of how Delilah has been interpreted, because artists and poets and writers have always loved wicked women.
Well, the Delilah story is, of course, the Samson story, and understanding where Samson sits in the book of Judges is a very important thing, it seems to me. The book of Judges begins by telling you this is not going to be a happy, upbeat story.
Israeli's strongman Samson had a weakness for harlots and foreign women. When he spotted the beautiful stranger Delilah, his hormones went into overdrive. They became an item. Samson had a secret, the source of his superhuman strength. The Philistines wanted to take him down and offered Delilah pieces of silver to discover his secret. She used her womanly wiles. Twice Samson lied, but the third time, Samson spilled. He'd promised God to never cut his hair. As he slept, Delilah took his hair, and with it, his power.
Delilah becomes a kind of a synonym for the powerful seductress, the powerful temptress who will use a man for her own purposes. There are references, oh, she's a Delilah, and it refers to a type of woman who will manipulate and exploit and take advantage of a man who's vulnerable in some way. There seems to be a tendency among readers and interpreters and people on the street to put all of these women from the Hebrew Bible, from the New Testament, into the category of prostitute, when the biblical stories give no justification for it whatsoever.
By placing her story right after the story of the prostitute, the assumption is easily made by the readers that Delilah's a prostitute as well. The text never calls her that. The text never names her as a prostitute. She's just Delilah, and she's a woman who lives in the Valley of Sorek. And the Valley of Sorek is border country between the Philistines and the Israelites.
As described in the book of Judges, 13th century BC Israel was a loosely knit union with military men like Samson in leadership roles. His downfall, at Delilah's hands, would pave the way for a new society ruled by kings. Delilah was an outsider from the Valley of Sorek on Israel's southern border with Philistia.
What I think we are meant to understand is that she is some kind of foreigner. She is in some way an enemy to the Jewish people or to the nation of Israel. So she is an outsider that is a threat.
The whole story takes place in the context of an ongoing conflict between Israel and the Philistines, where the Israelites are struggling to free themselves from Philistine domination. And when Samson was conceived, it was predicted that he would be the one to begin to free the Israelites from Philistine oppression. So at the point where he meets Delilah, he falls in love with her, and her compatriots see in this an opportunity to finally bring Israel down by finding a way to rob him of his strength.
I think in some sense, one could read it metaphorically as that very common thread in the Hebrew Scriptures, which is if one would mix with the other, with the foreign woman, that Israel is losing its sort of purity and its chosenness. And so it's always a warning against any kind of mixing with the other.
This is an interpretation that has been suggested that the cutting of the hair is a symbolic castration. His power, which is the kind of an amplification of masculine power, is completely removed from him by the act of cutting his hair.
Of course, it takes two to tango. Samson may have been a strong man physically, but he sure wasn't leading the dance intellectually.
She tells him right away, right from the start, what she wants. Tell me how it is that you're so strong so that you can be bound. Tell me what it is that makes you so strong so that we can make that go away and you won't be strong anymore.
Samson has never seemed to me to be the sharpest knife in the toolbox or the brightest star in the sky, or however you would, whatever metaphor you'd want to use. What always strikes me is that he doesn't seem that concerned with the fate of his people.
Samson clearly has no great deep admiration for women. He sleeps with prostitutes. He causes his first betrothed to be burnt alive with her household. So this is not someone with a deep appreciation for the female sex or a great love for them. And so she puts herself in danger for this. And I think that to do so for economic gain is not a crime, necessarily.
Even though the text does not clearly say that Delilah was a harlot, it's very definite about the fact that Samson visited prostitutes. And that wasn't the worst of his bad boy behavior. When she maneuvered Samson into telling her the secret of his strength and chopped his hair, Delilah became one of the most notorious women of the Bible, often distracting readers from Samson's bad behavior.
There's a measure of narcissism to Samson, where he's always, instead of looking towards God, he's turning his eye inwards to himself. And this is ultimately his downfall.
Samson, who seems more or less oblivious to the fate of his people and to his important role as a judge, and he just follows women around. He falls in love with women all the time, unsuitable ones, usually the daughters of his enemies. And every time he loses, but he keeps on doing this.
He has no sense of delayed gratification, that you can want something and don't get to have it right away, which is something we have to teach our children. But Samson never seems to have learned that. Whenever he wants something, he wants it now. He's like a teenage boy.
Samson is one of these figures who is so caught up in his brute strength. He'd be equivalent nowadays to men who spend a lot of time in the gym and look in the mirror to see themselves, build their muscles.
This was not a guy you'd want as a next-door neighbor.
He doesn't seem to act in a way that we would consider particularly godly or appropriate. He likes wine, women, rude jokes, carousing. He set people on fire quite happily, and he's like an overgrown child.
I think it's a very, very violent culture that he's in, and that the only way to save your people is to slaughter your enemy. But he becomes obsessed with the slaughter.
In fact, Samson's rap sheet was a mile long.
He's not supposed to drink. He's supposed to live a very holy life.
He is a judge of Israel. At the same time, he's going to harlots in Philistia.
He's just following women around against the judgment of all the people around him. Yet he's a leader of Israel. He doesn't seem particularly wise in any matter.
Samson is not the man in the Bible who I personally would pick as being a reliable breadwinner. So if I were in a relationship with Samson, I would want to have my own bank account.
And what a temper. Furious at an attempt to turn him over to his enemies, the Philistines, Samson broke free, grabbed the jawbone of a donkey, and started swinging. The Bible says he killed 1,000 men.
So he does these foolish things, but at the same time, it's also a humorous story about the stupidity of the Philistines, who are able to be killed in their thousands by a man wielding a donkey's jawbone.
A hero in Israel for his strength. By the time Samson met Delilah, he was public enemy #1 for the Philistines. And after 2 decades of apparently going straight, Samson was drawn back into what's clearly his sexual obsession. Sex with foreign women, and preferably paid sex.
I think perhaps Samson underestimates women. And it's not that they are wicked seductresses, but that he fails to see that they are actually a force to be reckoned with in the world, and that their force is often verbal or linguistic, and that he doesn't take this into account. And so Samson, this is another of his failures. By emphasizing the vulnerability of women, he makes use of women as prostitutes, and by underestimating them, he ultimately is unable to overpower the female. And it's not due to any deceptive power in the female.
When Samson fell in love with the beautiful Delilah, he fell hard. With this woman who's not identified as a prostitute, but was a foreigner, from the valley of Sorek.
It's hard to understand why he so foolishly reveals his truth. And this is why, historically, Delilah is seen as this great seductress. There must be something about Delilah that is so above and beyond all women that he cannot resist her. And in the art world, Delilah is often shown as very erotic and sexually, physically seducing him. In scripture, there's no emphasis on her physically seducing him. It's her words that are emphasized. That she is sort of rhetorically very powerful and persuasive. And that he succumbs to this rhetorical, that her rhetorical thrusts overpower his physical thrusts. And that he succumbs to this.
When Delilah agreed to uncover the secret of Samson's strength and disarm him, history blamed her for Samson's downfall. For centuries, that was the common interpretation. But it's not the only one. Delilah has been known as a bad girl ever since she extracted from Samson the secret of his superhuman powers and then disempowered him by cutting his hair. But was it all her fault?
In terms of interpreting scripture, and in terms of, instead of reading with the text, you can read against the text and say, well, is there another way of reading this character? Perhaps you could see her as a woman who wanted to provide for her own, and a woman who takes initiative, who does what she can to get what she wants. And maybe that's a woman you should laud, because there's a woman of power and using everything she has to get what she needs and wants.
What I love is that the stories allow you to imagine both Samson and Delilah as real people with complex emotions that compete with each other and sometimes undermine each other as well. And I would imagine, maybe I'm too much influenced here by the film, Samson and Delilah, that Samson either was so tired of being nagged by women and nagged by Delilah that he just gave in, or he simply, against his better judgment, began to trust her with tragic results.
What if the person judging the scene of Delilah cutting Samson's hair is not an Israelite, but a Philistine?
So what are we to make of Samson? And indeed, what are we to make of Delilah? Certainly, there seems to be a strong idea that at one level, she's simply behaving as a Philistine should, which from a Hebrew point of view is a bad thing, but I imagine from a Philistine point of view is a thoroughly noble thing to do.
So, as a Philistine, Delilah may have been fighting to preserve her own faith in multiple gods and goddesses against the Israelites' view of one God with a capital G.
I mean, in terms of what the peoples generally believed about the gods, the Israelites, of course, are, in the course of this story, they're on their way from polytheism towards the idea of one God. And certainly the Mosaic Party, if we can call them that, are advocating the leadership. People like Joshua are advocating that. But even at the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua has to ask the people whether they're now going to leave their other gods behind or not. So there is what we nowadays would call pluralism, although the Bible would not look well on that kind of pluralism. In the Judges period, therefore, you have a people of Israel who are themselves unsure about this religious business. And you also have peoples in the territory into which they're entering, in the surrounding countries, all of whom have pantheons of gods. And they may have this or that god who's more important, but it's certainly a plethora of gods. It's not one. So one of the dynamics of the story surrounds the struggle between an emerging monotheism on the one side and a fairly traditional polytheism on the other.
In this religious struggle, the Philistines were mortal enemies of the Jews, and Samson had killed many. So, the lords of Philistia paid Delilah to uncover the secret of Samson's superhuman strength. She's smack in the middle of a political war.
We have to remember in those days that things like marriage and so on were not simply matters for individuals. It wasn't about feelings and romance. These things were all tied up with society, with economics, with inheritance, with political treaties, and so on. And so the various biblical injunctions against marrying, with the foreign peoples are not to be thought of as fundamentally, I think, about ethnicity issues. It's fundamentally about political issues, allegiance issues, if you like. And the gods were entirely tied up with that. So, to marry into a family or to be involved in a sexual relationship in this way also involved the question quite quickly as to which gods you were worshiping.
After Samson lost his power, he was blinded and paraded through the streets, finally to the temple of Dagon, the Philistine god of fertility.
He becomes a wonderfully tragic figure, whereas earlier on in the Samson saga, he comes off a little bit as a buffoon. In the end, he redeems himself completely.
There, God gave him back his strength, and Samson brought the temple down on the Philistines and on himself. But what happened to the beautiful Delilah? Over centuries, Delilah became a symbol and lesson to both men and women about the power of female sexuality.
I think Delilah is one of the women who did use her beauty and her feminine wiles to get her way with men. And certainly that's how she's been interpreted in the 19th century by women. Harriet Beecher Stowe has a piece on Delilah, and she portrays Delilah as a very wicked woman, and she's the kind of woman whose life is a lesson for the rest of us.
But Samson does get that chance to bring down the temple on the Philistines.
But in the end, he redeems himself in some fashion in terms of at least taking measures to free his people from Philistine domination, which was the promise given to his parents when he was conceived to begin with.
He's the Rambo figure of the book of Judges, it seems to me. He goes in guns blazing, but the trouble is, it's rather indiscriminate, you might say. And he's not visibly somebody living by God's law, which is the larger context of the story, of course. Moses has given God's law. The reader inevitably is measuring the various characters against that standard. And by that standard, Samson falls fairly short. And he ends his life, of course, in an act of personal revenge, essentially. I think you're left wondering what you're supposed to make of this character.
He has focused on the physical. He has turned his way from God's truth. And so I think it's a consequence. And Delilah is an instrument used to bring about that consequence.
Some scholars believe that Delilah was in the temple when Samson brought it down, and the lovers perished together. But that's just a theory. Harlot or heroine? Delilah was most likely a political tool.
The whole book ends after Samson in societal dysfunction of a fairly marked kind, brutality and barbarism. And the author eventually throws his hands up in the air and says, you know, everyone who was doing what was right in his own eyes, because there was no king in the land. So the entire way of governing the people is up for grabs by the end of the book of Judges.
And that's what the story seems to be about. Now, of course, Israel ends up with a monarchy, including King David and King Solomon. And so the book of Judges, in a way, prepares the reader for that move. This is why it was necessary. Really, it wasn't ideal. But in the end, these judges were so problematic, to put it nicely, as leaders, that there was no choice. Israelite society was not going to continue, because here we have a judge who's just running around after women and not doing his job as a judge.
Delilah was most certainly an instrument in Samson's spiritual resurrection. Beyond that, a significant chapter of Israeli history may well be built on the story of this notorious woman, Delilah.